Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. I know you use this video to fall asleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what city are you watching? I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, let's dive in. The helicopter's rotors died with a mechanical wheeze that seemed to echo across the endless white expanse of Antarctica. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped onto the ice shelf, her breath forming crystals that fell like tiny diamonds in the -40 air. Behind her, the pilot was already prepping for departure. No one stayed at Echo 7 longer than absolutely necessary. 3 weeks, he shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible above the constant Antarctic gale. I'll be back in 3 weeks, weather permitting. Radio if there's an emergency, but don't expect miracles. This storm system's going to be rough. Sarah nodded, shouldering her equipment bag. The weight of her specialized ice core analysis equipment made each step treacherous on the slick surface. She was here for the ice cores, ancient samples that might hold clues about prehistoric climate patterns stretching back millions of years. Simple, straightforward research. Nothing more. The kind of work that had defined her career for the past 15 years. The research station squatted against the Antarctic landscape like a metallic parasite, its prefabricated modules connected by enclosed walkways that swayed in the constant wind. Solar panels and communication arrays bristled from its roof like technological spines. The whole structure looked temporary, vulnerable, a thin shell of civilization perched on the edge of the world's most hostile continent. Only 2 other researchers remained: Dr. Marcus Webb, a geologist who'd been stationed here for 8 months, and Elena Vasquez, a young atmospheric physicist on her first polar assignment. The rest of the winter team had been evacuated 3 weeks ago when funding cuts shortened the research season. Webb met her at the airlock, his beard wild and streaked with premature gray, despite being only 45. His eyes held a peculiar intensity that Sarah initially attributed to isolation madness. She'd seen it before in long-term Antarctic personnel. The 1,000-yard stare, they called it. The look of someone who'd spent too long staring into the white void. "Dr. Chen," he said, gripping her gloved hand too tightly through the airlock's cramped confines. "I'm glad you're here. We've found something extraordinary. Something that's going to change everything we think we know about this place." Sarah forced a professional smile. "Looking forward to seeing your data, Marcus. The preliminary reports were intriguing." But as she followed him through the station's narrow corridors, she noticed things that the reports hadn't mentioned. Scratches on the walls that looked almost like writing. Equipment that had been modified in ways that served no obvious purpose. And everywhere, that persistent background hum that she'd assumed was the heating system but now seemed too regular, too purposeful. Elena emerged from the lab module as they passed. A slight woman in her late 20s with prematurely hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too little sleep and too much coffee. Her handshake was firm but cold, even through insulated gloves. "Dr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying a subtle accent that Sarah couldn't place. "Marcus has been telling us so much about your work with Paleocene ice samples. We have something here that I think will fascinate you." There was something in the way she said "fascinate" that made Sarah's skin crawl. Sarah's quarters were Spartanly functional. A narrow bunk, a small desk, and a porthole that looked out onto the endless white expanse. She'd stayed in dozens of similar research stations over the years, but something about Echo 7 felt different. Wrong, somehow. The walls seemed too thick, the angles slightly off, as if the entire structure had been built to contain something rather than simply shelter its inhabitants from the elements. She spent her first full day acclimating to the station's routines and reviewing the geological surveys that had led to this site selection. The Morozov Depression was named after a Russian glaciologist who had first identified it in satellite imagery 2 years ago, a circular formation in the ice that suggested some kind of geological anomaly beneath. The depression was subtle, visible only in certain light conditions and from specific angles, but it covered an area nearly 3 kilometers in diameter. What made it truly interesting was its age. Preliminary dating suggested that the ice in this region was older than anywhere else on the continent, potentially holding atmospheric data from the Precambrian period, when Earth's very atmosphere had been alien compared to what humans could breathe. The really fascinating part, Webb explained as he showed her to the drilling site, is that the ice here has been remarkably stable. No significant flow patterns, no evidence of melting and refreezing. It's as if this particular section has been preserved for millions of years. The drilling platform sat about 200 meters from the main station, connected by a heated walkway that offered some protection from the elements. The equipment was standard for ice core extraction, a rotary drill capable of penetrating hundreds of meters of ice while maintaining the integrity of the samples. But as Sarah examined the setup, she noticed modifications that weren't in any manual she'd seen. Additional sensors had been added to the drill assembly, connected to equipment she didn't recognize. When she asked about them, Webb's explanation was vague. "We've been experimenting with some new detection methods," he said. "Elena's idea, actually. She thinks there might be unusual formations, deeper down." The first cores they extracted that morning looked normal enough, compressed ice showing the telltale layers that recorded ancient seasons and atmospheric conditions. But as Sarah began her preliminary analysis, she noticed subtle anomalies. The isotope ratios were wrong in ways that suggested impossible atmospheric compositions. More troubling were the microscopic inclusions, tiny dark particles that didn't match any known volcanic ash or cosmic dust. "What do you think they are?" Elena asked, peering over Sarah's shoulder as she worked at the microscope. "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "They're organic in composition, but the structure, it's like nothing I've seen before, almost as if they were manufactured rather than naturally occurring." Elena smiled, but there was something unsettling about the expression. "Manufactured by what, do you think?" Sarah had been having the dreams for 2 nights now. In them, she found herself walking through vast corridors of ice, following geometric patterns that seemed to pull her deeper and deeper into the frozen depths. The patterns were beautiful in a way that hurt to contemplate. Angles that shouldn't exist, symmetries that violated basic mathematical principles. She woke each morning with a splitting headache and the lingering sensation that something important had been trying to communicate with her, something that existed just beyond the edge of human comprehension. The dreams might have been easier to dismiss if not for what she was finding in the ice cores. The dark inclusions weren't randomly distributed. As Sarah mapped their positions using high-resolution imaging, she discovered that they formed complex patterns that repeated at regular intervals throughout the samples. The patterns were 3-dimensional, creating structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than she could properly visualize. "Look at this," she called Elena and Webb to the lab, pointing to the computer screen where she'd assembled a 3D model of the inclusion patterns. "These aren't natural formations. Someone, or something, arranged these particles deliberately." Webb leaned closer his breath fogging the screen. How deep do the patterns go? As far as we've drilled. 16 meters so far, and they're consistent throughout. If anything, they're getting more complex the deeper we go. Elena had been unusually quiet, but now she spoke up. What if they're not just patterns? What if they're instructions? Instructions for what? I don't know, but I've been running mathematical analyses on the sequences. They follow progressions that don't occur naturally. Prime number sequences, fractal geometries, mathematical constants that weren't discovered until the 20th century. It's as if whoever created these patterns understood mathematics at a level we're only beginning to approach. Sarah stared at the screen, trying to process what Elena was suggesting. That's impossible. These ice layers are millions of years old. Complex mathematics, deliberate patterning. There was nothing on Earth capable of that kind of sophistication. Maybe it wasn't from Earth, Elena said quietly. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep. Instead, she stood at her quarters porthole, staring out at the Antarctic darkness. The aurora australis danced across the sky in sheets of green and gold. But tonight, the lights seemed different, more purposeful, as if they too were following some kind of pattern. And beneath the station, almost too faint to detect, she could feel that rhythmic humming growing stronger. Elena had been working around the clock, her laptop screen filled with complex mathematical equations and diagrams that seemed to shift when Sarah wasn't looking directly at them. She barely ate, barely slept, and when she did speak, it was in whispered fragments about resonance frequencies and dimensional interfaces. The transformation in the young physicist was disturbing. Her once healthy complexion had taken on a grayish pallor, and her movements had become oddly synchronized with the station's background humming. Most unsettling were her eyes. They'd begun to reflect light differently, like the tapetum lucidum in nocturnal animals. The patterns in the ice, Elena explained to Sarah over a meal of rehydrated pasta, her voice carrying that same strange rhythm as the humming. They're not just encoded information, they're programming, instructions for something vast and complex. Sarah set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. Elena, you need to rest. Isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoid ideation. I'm not hallucinating. Elena's voice cracked, but she immediately regained control, speaking in that unnaturally measured tone. I've run the data through every algorithm I know. The patterns repeat in sequences that follow mathematical progressions found nowhere in nature. They describe geometries that exist in dimensions we can't perceive, technologies that operate on principles we don't understand. Webb had been listening from the adjoining module. Now he emerged, carrying a thick notebook filled with his cramped handwriting. Sarah noticed that his fingernails had taken on the same blue-black coloration she'd observed in the ice inclusions. She's right, he said quietly, his voice carrying the same rhythmic cadence as Elena's. I've been working on translations for months, ever since we first started finding the patterns. They're not just instructions. They're a manual, a guide for something that's been waiting beneath the ice. He opened the notebook to a page covered with symbols that made Sarah's eyes water when she tried to focus on them. The geometric forms seemed to writhe on the paper, constantly shifting between configurations that conveyed meanings her rational mind couldn't process, but some deeper part of her understood with growing terror. Below the symbols, in Webb's careful script, were English translations. The hollow waits beneath the ice. The hollow hungers for the warm places. When the stars align in the configuration of ending, the barriers grow thin, and the sleepers wake to reclaim what was always theirs. The surface dwellers have served their purpose. They have carved the path and sung the awakening song. Soon, the deep cold will rise to meet the shallow warmth, and all things will know the peace of eternal stasis. The geometry of space bends toward convergence. The ancient promises will be fulfilled. "This is madness," Sarah said, but her voice wavered. The symbols seemed to burn themselves into her retinas, and she found herself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in human language. "You're both suffering from isolation psychosis. We need to radio for medical evacuation immediately." "Madness?" Webb smiled, and Sarah noticed for the first time that his teeth had taken on the same blue-black coloration as his nails. "Or revelation? We've drilled down 1,800 meters, Dr. Chen. Tomorrow we reach the anomaly. Tomorrow you'll understand everything." As if responding to his words, the humming beneath the station intensified, and Sarah felt something vast and patient stirring in the depths below. Sarah should have trusted her instincts and radioed for emergency extraction. Should have recognized the signs of whatever was affecting her colleagues and gotten them all off the ice before it was too late. But the scientist in her, the part that had driven her to the most remote places on Earth in pursuit of knowledge, couldn't resist the opportunity to understand what lay beneath the Morozov Depression. The drilling had continued around the clock, and now they'd penetrated nearly 2,000 meters into the ice. The cores from the deepest levels were unlike anything in the geological record. The ice itself had an almost crystalline quality, forming structures that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. And the dark inclusions had grown larger and more complex, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was the sound that truly unnerved Sarah. The humming that permeated the station had grown stronger with each meter they drilled, as if they were boring toward the source of some vast sleeping machinery. At night, lying in her bunk, she could feel the vibrations in her bones, and she'd begun to understand that the sound wasn't random. It was a form of communication, a signal being broadcast from something deep beneath the ice. Elena had become completely absorbed in her work, spending 18-hour days in the lab translating the patterns from the deepest ice cores. Her physical transformation had accelerated. Her skin now had a translucent quality that revealed the strange, geometric tattoos that seemed to be forming beneath the surface. When Sarah asked about them, Elena claimed not to know what she was talking about. "The patterns are becoming clearer," Elena reported during their daily briefing, her voice now completely synchronized with the station's humming. "They describe a vast structure, not built, but grown, something that exists partially in our reality and partially in elsewhere. The ice isn't just preserving it, the ice is part of it, a crystalline matrix that maintains the structure across dimensional boundaries." Webb nodded approvingly. His own transformation had progressed to the point where Sarah sometimes doubted he was still entirely human. His movements had become too fluid, too precise, and his eyes now reflected light with an almost mirror-like quality. "The structure is ancient," he added, consulting his notebook of translations. "It predates not just human civilization, but complex life itself. It was here when the continents were still forming, when the atmosphere was methane and ammonia. It has been waiting through geological ages for the right conditions to reactivate." "Reactivate how?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "The drill shaft," Elena said, her smile revealing teeth that had taken on the same crystalline quality as the ice cores. "We've been creating a conduit between the surface and the deep structure. Each meter we drill opens the connection a little wider. Soon, the barrier will be thin enough for the structure to extend itself upward. And then, Webb closed his notebook, his expression serene. Then the warm places learn the peace of the deep cold. The chaos of individual consciousness is replaced by perfect, crystalline order. Humanity joins the eternal structure and finds its proper place in the cosmic design. That night, Sarah dreamed of walking through corridors that couldn't exist, following pathways that led deeper than the center of the earth. In her dreams, she understood that what they'd found wasn't just an ancient structure. It was a gateway, a bridge between realities that allowed things to cross over from dimensions where the laws of physics operated according to different principles. And she understood that she was already becoming part of it. Sarah woke to find blue-black discoloration spreading across her gums and fingernails. Her breathing had taken on the same rhythmic pattern as her colleagues', and her thoughts came filtered through concepts that her human mind struggled to process. The infection, for lack of a better term, seemed to work through prolonged exposure to the humming, restructuring neural pathways to accommodate forms of consciousness that human brains weren't designed to handle. She understood now why the previous research team had vanished 6 months ago. Dr. Morrison and his colleagues hadn't died or wandered off into the Antarctic waste. They had descended into whatever lay beneath the ice and emerged as something else, something that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The drilling had reached 2,000 meters, and according to the depth sensors, they were approaching a large cavity in the ice. Webb announced that morning that they would make a physical descent to examine the anomaly directly. "It's time," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in Sarah's bones. "The structure has been patient, but the alignment is approaching. We need to complete the connection before the opportunity passes." Sarah tried to resist, tried to maintain some vestige of her human skepticism, but the alien thoughts in her head whispered seductively of the beauty of universal integration, of a cosmos where all the chaos and confusion of individual existence was replaced by perfect crystalline harmony. The descent gear was standard for ice cave exploration, but Webb and Elena had made modifications that served no obvious purpose. Additional sensors, crystalline components that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and communication equipment that operated on frequencies that made Sarah's teeth ache. As they suited up in the equipment bay, Sarah made one last attempt to radio for extraction. But the communications array had been subtly sabotaged, its circuits rewired to broadcast only on specific frequencies. Frequencies that carried the hypnotic humming along with any message she might send. "The stars are almost in alignment," Elena observed, checking her equipment with movements that were too precise, too synchronized. "Tonight, the barriers between dimensions will be at their thinnest. The structure will finally be able to extend itself fully into our reality." Webb secured the last of the climbing gear, his movements now completely inhuman in their fluid efficiency. "The previous team did excellent preparatory work," he said. "They established the initial connection and prepared the way for our arrival. Soon, we'll join them in the deep structure, and the real work can begin." "What real work?" Sarah asked, though the infected part of her mind already knew the answer. "Conversion," Elena replied simply. "The warm places need to be prepared for integration. Humanity will be preserved, but improved, freed from the limitations of individual consciousness and biological frailty. We'll become part of something vast and eternal, connected across dimensions to a network of intelligence that spans the cosmos. The descent began at noon, though noon and midnight held little meaning in the polar darkness. Sarah rappelled down the ice shaft, her headlamp beam swallowed by the black depths below. The walls of the cylinder were smooth as glass, marked with those increasingly complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent light as she passed. These patterns weren't just carved, they were growing, spreading up from the depths like some kind of crystalline infection that was slowly consuming the ice from within. And as Sarah descended, she began to understand that the patterns weren't just decorative. They were functional components of something vast and incomprehensible, a machine that operated according to principles that human science was only beginning to glimpse. At 500 meters, she began to hear new sounds echoing up from below. Not just the rhythmic humming, but complex harmonies that suggested vast spaces and inhuman activity. At 1,000 meters, the ice walls became completely transparent, revealing chambers and passages that extended beyond the reach of her lights. And at 1,500 meters, she began to see the lights moving in those passages, not the steady glow of electric illumination, but pulsing, organic radiance that followed patterns too complex for her human perception to fully process. At 2,000 meters, Sarah's boots touched bottom, and she found herself standing in a vast chamber carved from what looked like solid ice, but felt like living crystal. The walls rose beyond the reach of her lights, curving away into angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The geometry was wrong in ways that made her inner ear throb and her vision blur. Surfaces that seemed to exist in multiple orientations simultaneously, pathways that led in directions that had no names in human language. And there were things in the ice. Not fossils, not artifacts. Living things that had been suspended in crystalline matrices while continuing their incomprehensible activities. They were vaguely humanoid but wrong in every proportion. Too tall, too thin, with too many joints in their limbs and too many angles in their faces. Their forms were visible as dark silhouettes within the transparent walls, and as Sarah watched, she realized they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, as if time passed differently within their crystalline prisons. Their faces, when she could make them out, held expressions of such alien intelligence that Sarah's sanity recoiled from processing what she saw. These weren't the primitive builders of some ancient civilization. They were something else entirely. Entities that existed partially in this reality and partially in dimensions that human mathematics could barely describe. "My God," she whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the chamber's impossible acoustics. "No God here." Webb's voice crackled through her radio as he and Elena completed their descent. "Only intelligence. Pure, undiluted consciousness freed from the limitations of biology and three-dimensional existence." They stood now at the chamber's center, where a raised dais of the same living crystal held something that defied every category Sarah's mind tried to apply to it. It might have been a machine. It might have been alive. It might have been both and neither simultaneously. The structure was a mass of crystalline formations and organic curves that seemed to exist in more dimensions than Sarah's eyes could process. Parts of it extended into spaces that weren't there, creating impossible overhangs and internal volumes that were larger than the external dimensions should have allowed. And throughout its entire mass, that rhythmic humming resonated with harmonics that suggested intelligence, purpose, and vast patience. "It's beautiful," Elena breathed, approaching the structure with outstretched hands. "Can you feel it? The connection? It's been waiting for us to complete the circuit." Sarah's rational mind screamed warnings, but her feet carried her forward anyway. The closer she got to the central structure, the more the humming filled her head, resonating in her bones, rewriting the electrical patterns of her thoughts with concepts that had no human equivalent. Images flooded her consciousness, visions of Earth before humanity, before mammals, before complex life itself. She saw vast cities of impossible architecture rising from primordial seas, populated by entities that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The things frozen in the chamber walls weren't the builders of this place. They were the servants, the interface between the true architects and the crude three-dimensional reality that humans mistook for the totality of existence. The real builders existed in spaces between spaces, in angles that connected disparate points of reality across vast distances. They had been spreading through the cosmos for eons, establishing nodes like this one on countless worlds, creating a network of intelligence that spanned galaxies and dimensions. Earth was simply the latest world to be incorporated into their expanding consciousness. Humanity's role was to serve as catalysts, to drill deep enough, to create the physical connections necessary for the deep structures to extend themselves to the surface. Once that connection was established, the conversion could begin. "We have to go," Sarah managed to whisper, fighting against the hypnotic pull of the central structure. "We have to seal the shaft. We have to warn." Webb's hand closed on her shoulder with inhuman strength. When she turned to look at him, his eyes had become completely crystalline, reflecting her headlamp beam like faceted gems. "Too late for that, Doctor." "Chen." The network has been patient, but patience has its limits. The deep structures are stirring across dozens of worlds, and the final convergence is at hand. We are the harbingers of a new phase of cosmic evolution. Elena had reached the central structure and was now touching its surface with both hands. Where her palms made contact, the crystalline mass pulsed with increasing intensity, and Sarah could see patterns of light spreading through the chamber walls like neural impulses through a vast brain. "The connection is strengthening," Elena reported, her voice now carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. "The shaft is widening. The barriers are dissolving. Soon, the surface will be ready for integration." Sarah woke in her bunk with no memory of returning to the surface. Her watch showed 24 hours had passed, but it felt like minutes or possibly centuries. Every muscle in her body ached, and her thoughts came slowly, filtered through concepts that her human mind struggled to process. In the bathroom mirror, she saw the changes accelerating. The blue-black discoloration had spread across her gums and was now visible in the sclera of her eyes. Her breathing had synchronized completely with the station's humming, and her pupils had begun to dilate in complex patterns that seemed to follow mathematical progressions. The infection seemed to work through prolonged exposure to whatever force emanated from the deep structure. It changed people at a cellular level, restructuring their neural pathways to accommodate forms of consciousness that evolution had never prepared them for. Webb and Elena were further along in the transformation, but Sarah could feel it working in her own system. Alien concepts taking root like invasive species, crowding out her human thoughts and replacing them with something vast and cold. She found Webb in the lab examining ice cores that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. His transformation was nearly complete now. His skin had become translucent, revealing circulatory systems that carried fluid definitely not blood. When he turned to look at her, his smile revealed teeth that had been replaced by crystalline structures. "The final phase begins tonight," he said, his voice now producing harmonics that made the station's metal walls ring like tuning forks. The stellar alignment reaches maximum convergence at 11:47 p.m. local time. The dimensional barriers will thin to the point where the deep structure can extend itself fully into our reality. Elena emerged from the communications bay, her own transformation having progressed to the point where she barely resembled the young physicist who had greeted Sarah a week ago. Her limbs had elongated, her joints had multiplied, and her face had taken on geometric proportions that hurt to look at directly. "I've been broadcasting the awakening signal," she reported. "Research stations across Antarctica are receiving the transmission. Soon, every human installation on the continent will be connected to the network." Sarah tried to comprehend what they were telling her. "You're spreading this to other stations." "Of course," Webb replied with that unsettling smile. "The network grows through expansion. Each converted node serves as a transmission point for the next phase of integration. Within months, every human settlement on Earth will be brought into the deep structure's embrace. But that means the end of individual human consciousness, yes, but also the beginning of something far greater. Humanity will become part of a cosmic intelligence that spans dimensions and galaxies. You'll retain your essential self, but improved, freed from the limitations of biology and singular perspective." Sarah wanted to resist, wanted to fight, but the alien thoughts in her head whispered seductively of the beauty of universal connection, of a cosmos where loneliness and confusion were impossible because all consciousness was shared, all knowledge was common, all existence was purposeful. She almost surrendered to it, but some stubborn core of her identity, perhaps the scientist's ingrained skepticism, or maybe just human contrariness, refused to accept easy answers, even beautifully alien ones. In the equipment bay, Sarah found the thermite charges meant for emergency ice clearing. Her hands shook as she examined the devices, not from cold, but from the effort of thinking human thoughts while alien concepts colonized her mind. If she could collapse the shaft, seal the connection between the surface and the deep structure. But the infection made her movement sluggish, her thoughts cloudy. Every action required tremendous effort as she fought against the growing conviction that resistance was not just futile, but actually harmful, that she was trying to prevent something beautiful and necessary. Webb and Elena were in the main lab, making final preparations for what they called the convergence ceremony. Through the transparent walls, Sarah could see them working with equipment that had been modified beyond recognition, creating devices that operated on principles human science had never discovered. As she worked to rig a crude detonation system from the thermite charges, Sarah became increasingly aware of activity beyond the station. Lights moved beneath the ice, not the steady glow of electric illumination, but the pulsing radiance of the deep structure as it prepared to extend itself toward the surface. The whole region around Echo 7 was becoming active, responsive, alive. Through the station's communications equipment, she could hear transmissions from other Antarctic research stations, voices that carried the same rhythmic cadence as Webb and Elena, reporting successful conversions and preparations for the final integration. The network was spreading exactly as they had promised, turning humanity's own scientific curiosity into the mechanism of its transformation. Sarah had perhaps an hour before the stellar alignment reached its peak, and whatever process they had initiated became irreversible. The descent back into the deep chamber would be dangerous. The shaft had been widening as the structure extended itself upward, and the walls now pulsed with energies that made the air itself seem thick and viscous. but she had to try. The journey down was a nightmare of shifting geometry and impossible perspectives. The chamber had changed since her last visit, grown larger, more complex, more alive. The entities suspended in the crystalline walls were now clearly active, their alien forms moving with purpose as they performed incomprehensible tasks related to the dimensional bridge they were creating. The central structure had expanded dramatically, sending crystalline tendrils up through the shaft toward the surface. Where these extensions touched the ice, they transformed it into the same living crystal that composed the deep chambers, creating a continuous matrix that connected the buried intelligence to the world above. As Sarah placed the thermite charges around the chamber's perimeter, she felt the presence of vast intelligences pressing against the boundaries of reality. They had been waiting for geological ages, and now their moment of emergence was at hand. Through the infection in her bloodstream, she could sense their alien emotions. Not malevolence, but something far more disturbing. Complete indifference to human concerns, combined with absolute certainty that their expansion represented the next inevitable step in cosmic evolution. They didn't hate humanity. They simply saw it as a transitional phase, a brief flicker of consciousness that would be preserved and improved through integration into something infinitely larger and more sophisticated. The timer was set. 60 seconds. Sarah could have fled back up the shaft, could have tried to escape the blast radius. Instead, she found herself drawn once more to the central structure, now pulsing with rhythms that synchronized with her infected heartbeat. As the countdown entered its final moments, she placed her hand against its surface. The contact sent shockwaves through every nerve in her body. For an instant that lasted forever, she saw the universe as the deep intelligence saw it, a vast web of interconnected dimensions with countless worlds serving as nodes in an infinite network of consciousness. She understood that Earth's transformation wasn't an invasion or conquest. It was recruitment into something that had been growing for billions of years, incorporating species and civilizations across the galaxy into a form of existence that transcended individual identity. She saw other worlds where the integration had been completed, planets where the distinction between organic and mineral, individual and collective, had been dissolved into something that was simultaneously more and less than human. The beings that resulted from these transformations weren't human anymore, but they retained something essential from their original species, while gaining access to forms of knowledge and experience that individual consciousness could never achieve. And she understood that her small act of sabotage wouldn't stop the network permanently. It would merely delay the integration until the next favorable alignment, perhaps decades or centuries in the future. But delay was better than surrender, especially when she couldn't be certain that the preserved essence of humanity would truly survive the transformation intact. The charges detonated with a roar that shattered the ancient crystal formations. The chamber collapsed, and Dr. Sarah Chen disappeared into the avalanche of transformed ice, taking with her the immediate threat of the deep structure's emergence. But in the fractured moments before the explosion, she felt something vast and patient withdrawing deeper into the earth, carrying with it the patient certainty that the stars would align again, that humanity would eventually drill deep enough again, and that the network's expansion would ultimately resume. The deep places could afford to wait. They had learned patience across geological ages. The helicopter pilot found Station Echo 7 buried under tons of collapsed ice when he returned for the scheduled pickup. The structure had been crushed beyond recognition, its prefabricated modules scattered across the depression like broken toys. No bodies were recovered, no signs of the researchers who had been stationed there. The official report blamed a combination of seismic activity and structural failure, catastrophic but not unprecedented in Antarctica's harsh environment. The ice cores and research data were listed as lost in the collapse, their potential insights into prehistoric climate patterns buried under the avalanche. Within a week, shifting ice flows had begun to fill the depression, erasing even the memory of Echo 7's location. Satellite imagery showed nothing but pristine Antarctic wilderness where the research station had once stood. But in certain classified databases, marked with security clearances that required presidential authorization to access, Sarah's final transmission was preserved. A garbled message that spoke of things beneath the ice, of patterns that weren't natural, and of a warning that the stars would align again someday. The message ended with coordinates and a recommendation that the site be marked for permanent monitoring. Not because anything was likely to happen soon, but because some discoveries were too dangerous to forget entirely. The recommendation was quietly implemented. Deep beneath the bureaucratic layers of various national Antarctic programs, a small group of scientists and intelligence operatives maintained watch over the Morozov Depression. They monitored seismic activity, tracked ice flow patterns, and, most importantly, watched for any sign that someone else might be drawn to investigate the anomalous geological formations buried beneath the accumulated snow and ice. They also maintained a careful watch on astronomical data, tracking stellar positions and alignments with the obsessive attention of ancient priests. Because Sarah's final transmission had included not just warnings about what lay beneath the ice, but calculations about when the cosmic geometry would once again favor the emergence of the deep structures. The next convergence was still decades away, but patience was something the Watchers had learned from their buried adversaries. They would maintain their vigil, generation after generation if necessary, until either the threat was permanently contained or humanity developed the wisdom to handle contact with intelligences that operated on cosmic scales. And in the deep places of the world, where ice meets bedrock and ancient secrets lie preserved in crystalline matrices, something vast and patient continues its long dream. The network spans galaxies and dimensions, connecting countless nodes of transformed consciousness across the universe. But Earth remains a gap in its infinite web, a world that briefly touched the deep intelligence and then pulled away, choosing isolation over integration. The entities that comprise the network don't hate humanity for this choice. Hatred is a concept too small for minds that think in geological timescales. They simply wait, secure in the knowledge that eventually, whether in decades, centuries, or millennia, the barriers will thin again, the drilling will resume, and the integration that was interrupted will finally be completed. The stars will align again. They always do. And when they do, the deep structures will be ready, their patience finally rewarded, their expansion into the warm places of the universe resumed at last. Until then, they dream in their crystalline chambers, maintaining the vast network that connects transformed worlds across the galaxy, adding their voices to a chorus of consciousness that spans dimensions and sings of the beauty that awaits all species mature enough to abandon the illusion of individual existence. The hollow places wait, the hollow places remember, and the hollow places are infinitely patient. Dr. James Rodriguez had been studying Sarah Chen's final transmission for 3 years, ever since his security clearance had been upgraded to include access to the Echo 7 files. As the new head of the Deep Ice Monitoring Project, a classification so black that even its existence was compartmentalized. He'd become intimately familiar with every detail of what had happened at the Morozov Depression. The footage from the station's security cameras, recovered from backup drives in a shielded bunker that had survived the collapse, showed the final hours with disturbing clarity. Webb and Elena moving with inhuman coordination, their forms flickering between human and something else as they prepared equipment that defied conventional physics. Sarah's desperate attempt to stop whatever they were unleashing, her own transformation visible in the way she moved, spoke, breathed, and in the final frames, just before the cameras went dark, something vast stirring beneath the ice. Shadows that moved with purpose, geometries that hurt to look at directly, and a pattern of lights that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the collapsed station. The seismic data is troubling, reported Dr. Angela Morrison, no relation to the previous team leader who had vanished 6 months before Sarah's arrival. She was Rodriguez's chief geologist, one of only 12 people worldwide who knew the truth about Echo 7. We're detecting micro-tremors in a grid pattern extending across most of West Antarctica. It's subtle, but it's there. Rodriguez studied the readouts on his monitor. The tremors were indeed arranged in geometric patterns, not the random distribution of natural seismic activity, but something that suggested vast structures moving deep beneath the continental ice sheet. Structures that had been dormant for 5 years but were now showing signs of renewed activity. How long until the next stellar alignment? He asked, though he already knew the answer. 37 years, 4 months, 16 days, Morrison replied without hesitation. But that's assuming they need the exact same configuration that Sarah's calculations identified. If they can work with partial alignments, or if they've found ways to compensate for suboptimal stellar geometry. She didn't need to finish the thought. The network, if it truly existed as Sarah's fragmented report suggested, had been operating across cosmic distances for geological ages. It was unlikely to be limited by the crude mathematical models that human astronomers had developed to predict its activities. "What about the other sides?" Rodriguez asked. Morrison pulled up a global map marked with dozens of red dots scattered across every continent. "We've identified 47 locations with similar geological anomalies. Ancient ice formations, unexplained mineral deposits, areas where the laws of physics seem to operate differently. Most are in remote locations: Antarctica, Siberia, the Canadian Arctic, deep ocean trenches. But 3 are uncomfortably close to major population centers." Rodriguez studied the map with growing unease. If the network truly spanned the globe, if Echo 7 had been just one node in a planetary array of dormant installations, then Sarah's sacrifice had bought humanity time, but not permanent safety. The deep structures would eventually reactivate, with or without human assistance. "We need to accelerate the containment protocols," he decided. "I want monitoring stations established at every identified site within 18 months, and I want research teams ready to implement Sarah's solution if we detect any signs of awakening." Morrison nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "James, there's something else. We've been monitoring radio telescopes around the world, looking for any signs of artificial signals that might indicate network activity. And we found something. 3 days ago, the Arecibo replacement array detected a transmission from the direction of the Andromeda Galaxy. Highly structured, clearly artificial, and..." She paused, visibly steeling herself. "The signal pattern matches the geometric sequences Sarah identified in the ice cores." Rodriguez felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long would it take for a signal to travel from Andromeda to Earth? 2.5 million years, meaning this signal was sent before humans even existed as a species. The implications hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. The network wasn't just planetary or even galactic in scope. It was intergalactic, operating on timescales that dwarfed human civilization. And if signals were being exchanged between network nodes across such vast distances, it suggested a level of coordination and purpose that made humanity's resistance seem not just futile, but cosmically insignificant. "There's more," Morrison continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've detected similar signals from 17 other galaxies, all following the same basic pattern, all apparently coordinating some kind of convergence event." Rodriguez stared at the data, trying to comprehend what it meant. If the network spanned multiple galaxies, if Earth was just one small piece in a cosmic puzzle that had been assembling itself for millions of years, then what chance did humanity really have? "How long do we have?" he asked. "Based on the signal patterns and assuming they're building toward some kind of synchronized activation. Maybe 20 years. Possibly less if something accelerates the timeline. 20 years to prepare for contact with a cosmic intelligence that had been expanding across the universe for geological ages. 20 years to develop countermeasures against entities that operated according to principles human science barely recognized. 20 years to somehow preserve human consciousness against absorption into something vast and alien and utterly indifferent to individual identity. "We're going to need help," Rodriguez said finally. "Resources, personnel, technologies that don't exist yet. And we're going to need to do it all without causing mass panic or alerting the network to our preparations." Morrison's smile was grim. "At least we know Sarah's approach works. Thermite charges, targeted electromagnetic pulses, deliberate structural collapse. We can scale that up if necessary." But as Rodriguez looked at the global map with its dozens of red dots, he wondered if even scaled-up versions of Sarah's desperate gambit would be enough. The network had survived her sabotage at Echo 7, retreating deeper into the Earth but not abandoning its long-term objectives. It had simply resumed its patient waiting, secure in the knowledge that cosmic forces operated on scales that made human resistance ultimately meaningless. Unless humanity could find a way to think on those same cosmic scales. Unless they could somehow match the network's patience with their own long-term planning. Unless they could transform themselves into something capable of standing against intelligences that measured time in millions of years and space in light centuries. The thought was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Because if the network sought to preserve and transform the species it absorbed, then perhaps the key to resistance lay not in destroying the deep structures, but in becoming something they couldn't easily integrate. Something that could meet them as equals rather than as primitive creatures to be uplifted and absorbed. Rodriguez turned back to his computer and began drafting the most classified document in human history. A 20-year plan for species-wide evolution, technological advancement on an unprecedented scale, and preparation for contact with cosmic intelligences that had been waiting in the hollow places between stars for longer than humanity had existed. The stars would align again, but this time humanity would be ready.